Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to dad return format and taking a look at some of the secondary sort of fringe strategies at the time. So I consider dad return basically tier 0. And to me, if you weren't playing dad or dad DDT, you basically had to either play a just entirely anti-meta strategy like pre-Geyseris Glads with Shadow Imprisoning Mare, which technically did win the SJC that took place in Minnesota at the hands of Paul Levitin, or playing a deck that was basically an FTK deck. And there were a few iterations of FTK decks during the time. There were some based on Cyber Valley, some based on Shadow Priestess of Ohm. Today we're going to take our very first look at a Cyber Valley-based FTK strategy. For those of you who are unaware about how Cyber Valley works, if you combine it with Machine Duplication, you can do some really nasty things if you happen to draw Dimension Fusion. And if you combine that with Spell Economics, you can basically draw your entire deck. Some people tried to combine that with Exodia, so you actually saw some Exodia builds draw the entire deck by doing that combination, where every dimensional fusion is free because you don't have to pay for it due to spell economics, and then you can stack it back to the top of your deck with one of the 3 Cyber Valleys, and then draw 2 cards every iteration, and then eventually just draw your entire deck. Other versions tried to combine this combination of cards either with Shadow Priestess of Ohm or just a card like Toon Cannon Soldier. Today we're going to look at sort of the quintessential Toon Cannon Soldier version of this deck. There's a couple different pathways to FTKing. You can do kind of the older version of the FTK where it was Defusion, Spell Economics, either original Cannon Soldier or in this case Toon Cannon Soldier, and then Dark Magician to Chaos, where every Defusion is free, Defusion is returned to the hand with Dark Magician to Chaos, and then you just consistently burn for 500. That was sort of an early version of this FTK before Phantom Darkness released cards like Cyber Valley. Then this deck also has the second pathway to the FTK, as I referred to earlier, where it would do that Cyber Valley loop, and then since you get to draw the entire deck, eventually you see the Toon Cannon Soldier and the Dark Magician to Chaos, and then you eventually FTK that way. The early versions, which had existed in formats prior, relied on cards like Monster Gain, Reasoning to see some of these combo pieces. This deck can get to the FTK by just drawing the entire deck. So in any capacity, in both ways, we're going to rely on Cyber Valley, and in both ways, we're going to rely on Dimension Fusion. It will ultimately result in FTKing through Toon Cannon Soldier, but at least has 2 pathways to get there. When we look at this particular format and we look at kind of how we're going to craft this deck, we're basically just going to chock it full of draw power and hopefully just FTK. That's really the underlying strategy here. Before the opponent can summon Dark Arm, before the opponent can do anything, really just try and put together an FTK. This particular version, as I alluded to, is going to play Toon Cannon Soldier. I may eventually profile another version that actually topped at the SJC that took place in Costa Mesa. Mario Matteo from Team Comic Odyssey had a version that used Magical Explosion instead of Toon Cannon Soldier, which is a little bit of a different take on the deck. It also didn't play Spell Economics. So we might potentially profile that deck as well. But for today, we're going to take a look at what I'm going to call the Cyber Valley FTK deck, looking at one of the alternative strategies that you could have taken to an event during the peak of dad return before the emergency banning. That needs to be made very clear. Technically, this is the exact same format that a lot of people would then see as Gladiator Beast format when we actually look at Nationals. The emergency banning that took place about a month or 2 into the format banned Dimension Fusion, in which case all of the FTK strategies were cast aside. So the only time that you could actually play this deck is right when the format begins, when Phantom Darkness is released, and before the emergency banning. But nevertheless, let's take a deep dive look at Cyber Valley FTK.
All right, we'll start with 3 copies of Cyber Valley. Cyber Valley is critical essential to pulling off the FTK. We'll talk about the FTK once we get the entire deck profile, but we have 3 copies of Cyber Valley. Then we have, this might seem like a bit of overkill, 3 copies of Destiny Hero Diamond Dude. So we're playing 3 copies because we really just want to use Destiny Draw and Allure of Darkness to get rid of it. We also play a single copy of Disc Commander. This wraps up our entire Destiny Hero package. Something that's interesting to notice that this deck, at least in the main deck, elects not to use Elemental Hero Stratos because the only normal summon that you really can afford to use is on Cyber Valley if you plan on FTKing. If you have to summon Stratos, as powerful of a card as Stratos is, it actually counteracts your ability to FTK. We'll talk about that when we get to the actual combo itself. But that is our entire Destiny Hero package. We're using Reinforcements of the Army, and we're also using Destiny Draw plus Allure of Darkness, like I alluded to. So having the Diamond Dudes in the deck are basically just ways to facilitate that draw power where you never really want to normal summon it. And then Disc Commander's there because we have Monster Born and Monster Born and Premature Burial, 2 ways of recurring from the graveyard to get those additional draws. It really just ups the ability of this deck to turn through the deck as fast as possible with some of its draw power. In addition to that, when you Monster Born it and draw 2, you can then use it with Cyber Valley and draw even more cards. Yeah, it gets banished, but you've already kind of done the work by getting to draw basically 4 cards with that Singleton Disc Commander. So that's our entire Destiny Hero package. In terms of some of the other inclusions, we have 3 copies of Thunder Dragon. Right, we're going to play Card Destruction. It slims our deck 2 cards. We also play Magical Mallet. That's not the greatest thing in the world to do, but technically it does. If you don't draw the Thunder Dragons off the Magical Mallet, do get to see a different collection of cards. So there is a reason to include cards like Thunder Dragon in this particular strategy. There's 2 copies of Spell Striker. This is a card that we've never profiled in any deck before. Spell Striker is an interesting one. Basically, it lets you just special summon it from the hand by banishing a spell from your graveyard. That's primarily its only effect. It technically can attack directly, but that's not really all that important. You don't take any battle damage from attacks involving it, so if you were to do that, you could technically attack directly, and then when they kill it, you don't take any damage, but the game's not really going to last that long. The point of playing Spell Striker is to give you a monster that you can just special summon. You have a ton of spells in your graveyard, and then you can use it with Cyber Valley to draw cards. It's not limited to once per turn, so you can just continually special summon them. You get to special summon basically 2 if you draw your entire deck, and by doing so, you get to special summon it with Cyber Valley and draw a couple cards. We have Dark Magician of Chaos. It is pivotal in terms of facilitating some of the FTKs. You technically can actually FTK without it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's really important giving you sort of some backdoor FTK. And then we have a single copy of Toon Cannon Soldier, which is critical in actually pulling off the FTK. You could maybe play Shadow Priestess of Ohm, but if you're going to play Toon Table of Contents, which this deck is going to play, this one is just strictly better. But that is our monster lineup. The rest of the deck is all spells. So as I talked about in the intro, there's a couple ways of playing this type of strategy, some with Magical Explosion, some without. This is the version without Magical Explosion. We're going to start with 3 copies of Magical Mallet, 3 copies of Toon Table of Contents, searching out eventually Toon Cannon Soldier and not Toon World, unlike some of the other FTKs we profiled, 3 copies of Machine Duplication to go along with our 3 copies of Cyber Valley, 3 copies of Allure of Darkness to go along with our Diamond Dudes and some of the other Dark Monsters in our deck. 3 copies of Destiny Draw to go along with Diamond Dude and Disc Commander, giving us a pretty robust draw package to also go along with 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. This deck can FTK from infinite life base, basically, so it doesn't really matter if we give them an extra 1,000 life points. We can FTK regardless of their life points. Then we have 2 copies of Reinforcement of the Army, which might seem weird, seeing as how we do not play Stratas, but just getting access to Diamond Dude or Disc Commander slims our deck, and then also allows us to use them with some of the Destiny Draws Allures to draw cards. We have the Critical Spell Economics. We'll talk about Spell Economics momentarily. We have Card Destruction, Monster Reborn, Premature Burial, and then Defusion. It's a very clean monster lineup, very clean spell lineup. It's one of the reasons why I decided to profile this specific strategy with this specific deck list. For those of you, though, who are not fully aware of sort of the combos that this deck can pull off, I will show you some of the basic things that this deck can do when we combine these type of cards together. And basically why this deck is all draw power and then deck slimming like Thunder Dragon and Toon Table of Contents. So what the deck is ultimately trying to do is use Machine Duplication on Cyber Valley and then special summon the other Cyber Valleys from the deck. So then you end up with a field that looks like this. If you then use Cyber Valley to draw 2, and let's just say for the sake of discussion you have nothing else possible, if you activate a Defusion, you can bring these back, and then you can use a Cyber Valley to banish a card from your hand to put this on top of your deck, and then use these 2 to draw it back. Obviously, you're limited by the amount of times that you can pay Defusion, but if you have Spell Economics on the field, each Defusion activation is totally free. So having that combination of cards actually just lets you draw your entire deck, because you activate Defusion, you bring these 3 back, it didn't cost you anything, this goes to the graveyard, you banish this and a card in your hand to put this on top of your deck, you banish these 2 to draw it, you activate it, all 3 of these are banished, and then eventually you're going to be able to banish Toon Cannon Soldier, and then once you hit Toon Cannon Soldier, the game is basically over, because once you hit Toon Cannon Soldier, you're eventually also going to hit Dark Magician of Chaos, and then the Toon Cannon Soldier can tribute off the Dark Magician of Chaos and it gets to the banished pile. The Defusion can be activated to special summon these back. Technically, it summons this back too. This can recur this, but you don't even actually necessarily need to do this loop. So that traditionally, this loop here is sufficient also. But with Cyber Valley, you basically guarantee that you draw into that loop. Some of the early versions of this FTK in different formats, this was what was needed, and this is technically enough, right? You activate this, you bring this back, you add this to hand, you activate this, tribute this, activate this again, bring this back, and then each of these is free. This is technically an FTK here. This deck, though, can more consistently eventually get to this game state, because this is also just the FTK, because this lets you draw your entire deck as well, eventually drawing into these packages here, where eventually you get to draw these and then FTK that way. And basically this entire deck is all draw power to facilitate this combo. That's why we have D-Draw, Allure of Darkness, Disc Commander. You know, let's say you're really desperate, you can summon Spell Striker, draw 2 here. The first time you use Machine Duplication and your field looks like this, this can sometimes be less than ideal, because if you banish these 2 to draw, you have this that's just sitting there. And then sometimes you can summon the Spell Striker and then banish these to draw, and then next thing you know, you just drew 4 cards. And as long as you get access to Defusion, you will eventually win the game. And with all the draw power in this deck and all the slimming, although it is a singleton, you can eventually get to the combo. And especially with the Cyber Valley draw 2, the Upstart Goblins, Toon Table of Contents, Thunder Dragon, if you think about how we use Upstart saying is a 37 card deck, well, if you also play Thunder Dragon, you're sort of at a 35 card deck. And if you play Table of Contents, you're kind of at something like a 32, 33 card deck. And I guess you even have the Toon Cannon Soldiers, so you really are at a 32 card deck. So when you think about all of that, plus the 5 or 6 cards you get to draw at the beginning of the game, plus D-Draw and Allure, you are going through your deck really quickly, reinforcing the army too. So it might seem weird to play an entire combo deck based on one single spell, but you do often see it. This deck, unlike some of the turbo decks of the time, doesn't have Monster Gate or Reasoning to reliably put this into the graveyard. So you are instead just going to naturally draw it. And if you look again at the entire deck, it really just is all draw power, Magical Mallet as well. There are versions of this deck, though, that did try to mill this and use cards like Magical Explosion to FTK, which will eventually profile. But this is just your very clean spell economics, Defusion, Toon Cannon Soldier deck that's facilitated by the existence of Cyber Valley. So what's interesting here with this strategy is if you look at the version that actually was able to FOP 16 at the YCS in Columbus, you're going to see a strategy where in game 2, Paul McCain elected to side deck into essentially a Macrocosmos-based strategy. And I think that's an okay thing to do. I think that's something that you might consider doing if you're on a budget. This was often considered a budget deck because the Allure Darknesses and Destiny Draws were expensive. They're like $50 each back in the day. Cyber Valley was about $20. There's no Dark Arm Dragons in here, and there's also no Magical Stone Excavation. So 2 of the really expensive cards in the other Dark Arm strategies were not included. As a result, people that played this deck often did it because it was a budget option, and then you could side deck in different ways that didn't require any of those really expensive cards. As a result, sometimes you would see things like macro-based strategies where you would try to counteract the Dark Arm strategy, perhaps if you were going first. Let's just say, for the sake of discussion, you do have access to Dark Arm Dragon, but you still wanted to play the FTK. I think it makes a lot more sense to maybe smokescreen into a Dark Arm strategy. That way, if your opponent side decks in some of the narrow combo-centric counters, maybe cards like DD Crow, because right, a DD Crow and Defusion can just cripple your entire combo. You can side deck in something like Dark Arm Return, which is just an incredibly powerful deck itself. It's basically the tier 0 decks of the entire format. And you can very easily smokescreen into a Dark Arm Return strategy. Because you're considering the format is, DDT strategies, some various FTK DDT strategies. You, of course, have Dark Arm Return, and then there's the GB and the Samurai kind of anti-meta strategies with some things like gadgets even, and the Super Periphery. But it's really primarily a format where you have to worry about Dark Arm-based strategies and Destiny Hero-based strategies, and then a couple of the anti-meta strategies. All right, so you could go into the FTK in games 2 or 3, especially if you're going first, it's totally fine. You have to worry about DD Crow. DD Crow against the Defusion can be game-breaking because you don't really have a good secondary way of winning, per se. And that's really the best way of getting that loop going that we talked about earlier. As a result, I really like what Mario Maffeo and even Paul McCain did. These are the 2 decks that this particular strategy is based on. The main deck today is basically Paul's main deck exactly from the SJC that took place in Columbus. The side deck, though, is based a little bit more on Mario's deck from YCS Costa Mesa or SJC Costa Mesa. I think I would elect to play the one similar to Mario's. Mario elected to basically side deck in Dark Arm Return. Paul elected to put in sort of a Macrocosmos-based D-Fissure strategy, and I think if budget is not a concern, because remember, Dark Arm is 3 for 1,000 at this point in time, and if you're looking at a budget option, this main deck doesn't have Magical Stone or Dark Arm in it, and besides the D-Draw and Allure costing about $50 each, and maybe Cyber Valley being around $20, it's relatively cheap, all things considered. This deck, one of the main appeals was that it was sort of the budget option at the time. However, if budget is not a concern, but you want to play the FTK, I think it makes more sense to put in Dark Arm as the side deck option, because your opponent puts in a bunch of narrow combo-centric counters. The Dark Arm engine can really take advantage of that. So we're going to elect to put sort of a meld of Paul's main deck and Mario's side deck, although Mario's deck is based on the Magical Explosion version. And now I'm going to elect to play 3 Dark Arm Dragons, and then sort of the 2 big attack tribute monsters that are not in the main deck. There's already Dark Magician of Chaos, but Jinzo and Dark Lord Zerato. We commented on Zerato earlier when we profiled Dark Arm Return, where it's really important to have it as an access point when you use Defusion so that you can just destroy all your opponent's monsters and not worry about them having a big clogged field. Then we need some additional sort of traditional monsters that you would see in these strategies. We have a copy of Stratos because we're not main decking it, as I referenced earlier. We can't use our normal summon on Stratos. It needs to be Cyber Valley. We have Dark Grepher, which I think is just better than Armageddon Knight. Mario technically used Armageddon Knight. This deck doesn't have Dasher or Malicious, so there's not as many good targets, but it just fuels the graveyard faster than Armageddon Knight. Then we have a copy of Snipe Hunter. This deck probably benefits from Snipe Hunter because it doesn't have a lot of outs to back rows. You need to basically side deck all of them, and it's still a dark monster that can fuel the graveyard. And then I never profiled Prometheus in this strategy before, and Mario did technically include it in his side deck at Costa Mesa. Prometheus was popular in this format because you could just banish as many darks as necessary to manipulate down to 3 for Darkarm Dragon, and then technically late game with something like Return or Defusion, you can just outright win the game if you have your graveyard fueled enough. So Prometheus has some interesting applications looking at the format. Then we have a couple back row destruction cards because we don't have any in the main deck. We have both Heavy Storm, and I put Giant Trunade here because I think Giant Trunade is just a powerful enough card that if you're going to try an OTK and your opponent has Floodgates, they preemptively flip Royal Oppression, or they're using Macro and Defissure, and you can reliably OTK, it makes a lot of sense to include it. Then we have 2 Royal Decrees to kind of go along with that. And finally, 2 Return from the Different Dimensions. Mario technically played one of these and one Escape. I don't think Escape is nearly as good as this card. This card is so much better when you're playing Cyber Valley, because if you activate this, even if you're not outright OTKing, you can draw multiple cards off Cyber Valley and then even just put Return back to the top of your deck and then do it again the next turn and basically just loop Return from the Different Dimension for the rest of the game, which is one of the best reasons why I love Cyber Valley plus Return versions of Darkarm Dragon and not some of their early versions that played instead cards like Escape. And don't get me wrong, Escape is great because the monster sticks around, but honestly, this card is just better. So much better, so you can still summon Dark Magician of Chaos, but it gives you the added flexibility of getting back Cyber Valley, which to me is just absolutely game-breaking. The life points don't really matter. If your opponent's going to kill you, they're going to kill you. The 4,000 life or 2,000, however much you have to pay, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, probably won't matter. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.